My name is Walter Grissom, and I have owned 40 acres of land outside a small Texas town for the last 30 years. Long before any subdivision existed nearby, this land was mine, passed down from my father, who bought it back when the whole county was still open pasture. I built my house here with my own hands. I dug the well. I planted the oaks that now shade my porch. Back when my father first cleared this ground, there wasn't another house for 2 miles in any direction. Over the decades, the town crept closer, and eventually, a developer bought up the acreage on the dune, far side of the county road, and put in a subdivision called Meadowbrook Estates, all vinyl siding and matching mailboxes. I never had a problem with them. Their fence line stopped well short of mine, and for the first few years, nobody from over there ever gave me a second thought. So when a group calling itself a Homeowners Association patrol started rolling up my private road in a golf cart with a magnetic sign taped to the side, I knew something was off. My land had never been annexed into anything. I paid my own taxes directly to the county, separate from any association dues, and I'd never signed a single document putting my property under anyone else's authority. Whatever these men thought they were doing, it had nothing to do with any agreement I'd ever made. It started on a Tuesday morning in early spring. I was out checking my fence line when I heard the low hum of an electric cart coming up the gravel path that leads to my house. 2 men stepped out, both wearing matching polo shirts with a logo that read, Meadowbrook Estates Community Patrol. One carried a clipboard. The other had a radio clipped to his belt, like he thought he was working for the county. Sir, this property falls within our community boundary, the taller one said. We need you to remove that shed and repaint your fence to match the approved palette. I looked at him for a long moment. Son, I've lived on this land since before your Meadowbrook Estates was a hole in the ground. My property was surveyed and recorded decades before your development broke ground. You're standing on land that has never been part of any homeowners association. He didn't blink. He pulled a folded paper from his clipboard and held it out like it was some kind of court order. Our records show this parcel is under Meadowbrook jurisdiction. Failure to comply will result in fines and possible liens against your property. I've dealt with plenty of men who thought a laminated badge and a clipboard gave them authority they didn't have. Before I retired, I spent 22 years as a deputy sheriff in this same county. I know the difference between actual authority and a costume, and these two, badges and all, were wearing a costume. Let me see your paperwork, I said calmly, holding out my hand. The shorter one hesitated, glancing at his partner. That hesitation told me everything. A real code enforcement officer or an actual HOA representative would have handed it over without a second thought. Instead, the taller man pulled the paper back toward his chest. We don't need to show you anything further. You have 7 days to comply, or the association will take appropriate action. There is no association, I said. Not here. My land was carved out of the original ranch tract in 1974, 4 decades before Meadowbrook existed. It's never once been annexed, purchased, or folded into any HOA. You two need to get back in that cart and head off my property. Sir, I'd advise you to reconsider your tone, the taller man said, tapping his clipboard against his palm like it was a gavel. We document non-compliance for the file, and that file gets reviewed by our board every month. It's a lot easier on everyone if you just cooperate now. There's no board, I said. There's no file. There's a man in a golf cart standing on land he has no claim to, telling an old rancher what color to paint his fence. I've heard some strange things in my life, but this one's climbing the list fast. The taller man's jaw tightened. We have every right to patrol this area. The developer gave us authorization to enforce standards across the whole section, including outlying parcels. Outlying parcels that belong to other people, I said. That's called making things up as you go. They didn't leave right away. Instead, the shorter one started scribbling notes on his clipboard, glancing at my shed, my fence, even my old truck parked near the barn, as if cataloging violations that didn't exist under any law. I stood my ground, arms crossed, and told them plainly that if they didn't get off my land within the next minute, I'd be calling the real sheriff's department, the one I used to work for, and letting deputies sort out who exactly gave them this so-called authorization. That got a reaction. The taller man's confidence cracked just slightly, but he covered it fast. Go ahead and call. We work directly with the county on these matters. That was a mistake. I happen to know the current sheriff personally. We'd worked together for years before I retired, and I still had his cell number saved from back when we used to go fishing on weekends. I pulled out my phone right there in front of them and dialed. "Hey Wes, it's Walt," I said when he picked up. "And got a couple of fellas here in golf cart uniforms telling me my land belongs to some HOA that didn't exist 10 years ago. Says they've got county backing. That sound right to you?" There was a pause on the line, then a short laugh. "Walt, there's no HOA patrol with county authorization anywhere in that section. We've had 2 other calls this month about the same outfit. Hold tight, I'll send a unit your way." I hung up and looked at the 2 men, who had gone noticeably quiet. "Sheriff's Department is sending someone out. You're welcome to wait here and explain your authorization to them directly, or you can leave now and save yourselves the conversation." For a moment, neither of them moved. The cart sat idling behind them, its little electric motor humming in the quiet morning air. And somewhere off in the pasture, a cow bawled at nothing in particular. I could see the shorter man doing the math in his head, weighing whether it was worth sticking around to see how this played out. Whatever he decided fast, because he was already climbing back into the driver's seat before I finished my sentence. The shorter man immediately started walking back toward the cart, but the taller one stayed put, apparently unwilling to back down in front of his partner. "We're not doing anything wrong here. We're just doing our job." "Your job doesn't exist," I said. "Not on my land, and making up authority you don't have, especially to scare an elderly widow 2 properties over into repainting her house, or an old rancher into tearing down a shed. That's not a job. That's a scheme." His face went red at that. I could tell he didn't like being called out, especially not by someone who clearly wasn't buying the act. He puffed his chest slightly, trying to reclaim some ground. "You don't know anything about our operation. We have contracts. We have a whole team." "I know enough," I said. "I know real HOAs record their boundaries with the county. I know real enforcement comes with actual legal notices, not a laminated card and a golf cart. And I know that whoever's running your little operation picked the wrong piece of land to try this on, because I still have friends in uniform." About 10 minutes later, a patrol car came up my drive, kicking up dust behind it. Deputy Ramirez, a younger officer I didn't know personally, but who Wes had clearly briefed, stepped out and asked the 2 men for identification. The taller one fumbled for his wallet, suddenly a lot less confident than he'd been standing on my porch minutes earlier. It turned out, according to what Deputy Ramirez told me afterward, that this patrol wasn't affiliated with any legitimate homeowners association at all. A man named Curtis Boyle had been running a scam for the better part of a year, printing up fake polo shirts, fake letterhead, and fake violation notices, then going door to door in the outskirts of several developments demanding money for compliance fees or warning of liens that had 0 legal standing behind them. Most of his targets were older residents living just outside the actual HOA boundary. People Boyle figured wouldn't know enough to question a man with a clipboard and a confident voice. I wasn't the first person he'd tried this on, but I might have been the first person who used to carry a badge himself and still had the sheriff on speed dial. Deputy Ramirez took statements from both men on the spot. The shorter one, whose name turned out to be Danny Ruiz, folded almost instantly, admitting that Boyle had recruited him a few months back with promises of a steady paycheck for community enforcement work. He said he didn't know the whole thing was fabricated until residents started pushing back and asking questions he couldn't answer. The taller man, who introduced himself reluctantly as Boyle's cousin, Marcus, tried to stick to the story that they had legitimate authorization, right up until Ramirez pointed out that no such HOA was registered with the county clerk's office for this section of land at all. Over the following weeks, I learned more about how deep this scheme had run. Boyle had been targeting people who lived on parcels bordering the newer developments, betting that most of them wouldn't bother checking property records or calling the county to verify anything. He'd printed up notices that looked official enough, complete with fake case numbers and a sole return address that traced back to a rented mailbox 2 towns over. Several of my neighbors, folks I'd known for years, admitted they'd paid him money out of pure worry, thinking they were avoiding some kind of lien or legal complication down the road. One woman, Ruth Callahan, who lived alone on a small parcel about a mile from me, told me she'd handed over $300 in cash because Boyle told her failing to pay would result in the county placing a hold on her property deed. She was 78 years old and living on a fixed income, and that $300 mattered to her a great deal. She'd counted it out at her kitchen table the night before, she told me, worried sick that she wouldn't have enough left over for her water bill that month. But more worried still about losing the house her late husband had built for her back in 1968. When I heard that, something in me settled into a quiet, steady kind of resolve. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. This was somebody preying on people who couldn't easily defend themselves. Ruth wasn't the only one either. An elderly couple 2 roads over, the Pattersons, had been told their well permit would be revoked unless they paid an inspection fee that didn't still exist under any county code. A young widow named Delia Fontaine, raising 2 kids on her own after her husband passed, had been pressured into paying for a landscaping compliance review that amounted to nothing, more than Boyle glancing at her yard from his golf cart and shaking his head. I started keeping a folder. Every neighbor I spoke with, I wrote down what they'd been told, what they'd paid, and when. I encouraged each of them to file a report with the sheriff's department, and most of them did, once they realized they weren't the only ones. Deputy Ramirez and another investigator, Detective Alvarez, started building a case, and my folder ended up being useful groundwork for what they were already piecing together, independently. About 3 weeks after that first encounter on my porch, Boyle himself showed up at my place. I suspect he'd heard through Marcus or Danny that I was the one who'd Fandering Falls, the sheriff, and started organizing statements from other residents. He didn't come in a golf cart this time. He drove up in a plain grey sedan and got out slowly, hands visible, clearly trying to project an image of reasonableness. "Mr. Grissom," he said, walking halfway up my drive. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "There's no misunderstanding, Curtis," I said, using his first name deliberately. "I know exactly what you've been doing, and so does the sheriff's department at this point." He tried a different approach, softer, almost apologetic. "Look, I run a small operation. Times have been tough. I never meant for anyone to feel pressured. I just help maintain community standards, that's all. You've been telling widows their homes could be seized over compliance fees that don't ought exist," I said. "You've been showing up on land that was never part of any development, wearing a costume that makes you look like you've got authority you don't have. That's not community standards. That's a con, plain and simple." His expression shifted, the friendly mask slipping for a second before he caught himself. "You don't understand how hard it is to build something from nothing out here." "I understand plenty," I said. "I spent over 2 decades wearing a real badge, dealing with real authority and real responsibility that came with it. What you built wasn't a business. It was a way to squeeze money out of people too polite or too scared to ask hard questions." He didn't have much of an answer for that. He stood there for a moment, looking older and more tired than he had at the start of the conversation, then turned and walked back to his car without another word. That was the last time I saw him on my property, though it wasn't the last I heard of him. Detective Alvarez called me about a month later to let me know that the case against Boyle had moved forward substantially, with statements from myself, Ruth Callahan, and 6 other residents, along with financial records showing the money trail from various victims into accounts Boyle controlled. The county had enough to pursue formal charges. Marcus and Danny both cooperated once they understood the scope of what they'd been part of, and their statements helped confirm the timeline of how the operation worked, who had been paid, and how much. I went to the courthouse the day Boyle's case was heard. I wasn't required to be there, since my statement had already been submitted, but I felt like I owed it to Ruth and the others to see it through. Boyle sat at the defense table, looking nothing like the confident man who'd come. He stood on my porch with a clipboard, telling me I had 7 days to comply with rules that never existed. The prosecutor laid out the case clearly: false representation of authority, solicitation of payment under false pretenses, and a pattern of targeting elderly and isolated residents, specifically because they were less likely to push back. Ruth Callahan testified that day too. She stood up in front of the courtroom, small and steady, and explained how she'd handed over money she couldn't easily spare because she believed she had no other choice. Hearing her account out loud, in that formal setting, made the whole scheme feel even more deliberate and cold than it had before. This wasn't a man cutting corners on a legitimate business. This was someone who had built an entire operation around exploiting trust. The prosecutor also brought in a records custodian from the county clerk's office, who confirmed under oath that no homeowners association matching Boyle's TIRAC paperwork had ever been filed for that section of the county, and that the case numbers printed on his notices were fabricated, formatted to resemble real county filings but tracing back to nothing on record. Hearing an actual county official state plainly that the entire operation had been invented from scratch seemed to land hard on the jury, several of whom exchanged glances when the custodian read off the fake case numbers one by one. The judge didn't take long to reach a decision once all the testimony was in. Boyle was ordered to repay every dollar he'd collected under false pretenses, with additional penalties on top of restitution, and he was barred from operating any kind of property management or enforcement business in the county going forward. Marcus received a lighter sentence, given his cooperation, community service, and probation, while Danny, who had come forward earliest and most fully, avoided formal charges altogether in exchange for his testimony. After the hearing, Ruth found me in the hallway outside the courtroom. She took my hand in both of hers and thanked me, her eyes a little glassy. "I don't know what I would have done if you hadn't started asking questions," she said. "I would have just kept paying him, I think, out of fear. You would have figured it out eventually," I told her, though I wasn't entirely sure that was true. Sometimes it takes someone willing to stand their ground first, before everyone else feels safe enough to speak up too. In the months that followed, the Sheriff's Department put out a public notice warning residents in unincorporated areas near new developments to verify any HOA claims directly with the county clerk before paying fees or agreeing to compliance demands. A few local news outlets picked up the story, and for a while, my name came up more than I would have liked in conversations around town. I never wanted recognition for any of it. I just wanted the scheme to stop, and I wanted people like Ruth to feel safe on their own land again. My fence never got repainted to match anybody's approved palette. My shed is still standing exactly where I built it 15 years ago. And every so often, when I'm out walking the property line in the early morning, I think about that first encounter, the confident tone in Marcus's voice as he told me I had 7 days to comply, and how quickly that confidence crumbled once real authority showed up and asked the questions he couldn't answer. Land like mine doesn't come with a lot of guarantees. Weather turns, markets shift, and neighbors change over the years. But one thing has stayed constant since my father first cleared this ground decades ago. Nobody gets to walk onto it and tell me what it is or isn't, especially not with a fake badge and a clipboard full of nonsense. I spent my career upholding real rules, and I wasn't about to let a con man in a polo shirt rewrite them on my own front porch. Curtis Boyle picked the wrong parcel of land to try his scheme on, and more importantly, he picked the wrong landowner to underestimate. I may be retired, but old instincts don't fade easily, and neither does the willingness to stand up for neighbors who don't have the same tools I do. Ruth still stops by every few weeks with a jar of preserves or a loaf of something she baked that morning, and we sit on the porch and talk about nothing in particular, which is exactly the kind of quiet, ordinary afternoon she deserves after everything she went through. If there's one thing I hope people take from what happened out here, it's this. Never take a stranger's word for authority they claim to have. Always ask for the paperwork. Always verify with the actual county office. And never be afraid to make the call that puts a stop to something before it goes any further. A badge, a clipboard, and a confident voice don't add up to real authority. Real authority leaves a paper trail at the courthouse, and anyone unwilling to show you that trail probably doesn't have one worth showing. That's exactly what I did, and I'd do it again without a second thought. Because a piece of land that's been in the family for 3 generations deserves someone willing to stand at the gate and ask the hard questions when a stranger comes rolling slowly and confidently up my own gravel drive, uninvited.